Thank you for the kind introduction, Jeff. To the board and administration and faculty and staff and friends of the school, I want to express that it is a privilege for me to speak today, and especially to you all, the dedicated who have stayed after the food. I appreciate that. I'm starting to get a handle on what Friends Day is, but I can't say I fully understand the goal of this speech that I'm about to make. The only Friends Day that I've attended was the last one, and the speeches that day were intended to honor Alan McNichol on the occasion of his retirement. But today, I was simply asked to choose a topic and proceed. I understand and have delivered speeches in a variety of settings and genres before, so I'm familiar with the class lecture, the academic conference presentation, the sermon, even the youth devotional, and the adult Sunday school class. So I'm not sure which of these this is supposed to be closer to. So I think this morning I'm going to aim more for the Sunday school, adult Sunday school class type setting, and just having had coffee and drinks in hand, that might be appropriate. A thought-provoking Sunday school class, hopefully. And I'd like to leave time at the end, if we have time, for a question or two, if you're thinking of something. So be thinking of something along the way. So on to my topic. Since I teach church history, among other classes, I want to talk about something that's basic to my interests. Church history has received a bad rap, especially in the Restoration tradition. The American Restoration movement, or the Stone Campbell movement, was motivated by the desire to unite all Christians on the basis of restoration founded on the Bible only. This is the genius of the movement, and it's articulated in Thomas Campbell's Declaration and Address from 1809. The ideal was to restore the New Testament church and be New Testament Christians. All of us here acknowledge, I think, that the return to New Testament Christianity is surely a noble ideal. Emphasis on being the New Testament church, however, has its consequences. Let me mention two examples. In Proposition 4 of Declaration and Address, Thomas Campbell writes these words: that although the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments are inseparably connected, making together but one perfect and entire revelation of the divine will, for the edification and salvation of the church, and therefore in that respect cannot be separated, yet as to what directly and properly belongs to their immediate object, the New Testament is as perfect a constitution for the worship, discipline, and government of the New Testament church, and as perfect a rule for the particular duties of its members, as the Old Testament was for the worship, discipline, and government of the Old Testament church, and the particular duties of its members, end quote. In other words, although the Old Testament is still Scripture, it is not directly relevant to the task of restoring the New Testament church. Here we see steps toward the marginalization of the Old Testament in the Stone Campbell movement, an idea that Thomas's son Alexander would amplify 7 years later in his Sermon on the Law, explicitly abrogating the regulative character of the Old Testament in the New Testament church. Another consequence of being a New Testament church, and this is the one that I'd like to focus on this morning, and back to the Declaration and Address. In the very next proposition, after stating that only the commands and ordinances of the New Testament will be binding on the church, he writes, quote, "Nothing ought to be received into the faith or worship of the church, or be made a term of communion among Christians that is not as old as the New Testament." End quote. Let's call this the dictum. All right? So I will repeat it. Nothing ought to be received into the faith or worship of the church, or be made a term of communion among Christians that is not as old as the New Testament. Just as the emphasis on the New Testament church marginalizes the Old Testament on the more remote end of the story of God's people, this same emphasis also marginalizes church history on the more proximate end of this same story. According to this rule, just as we should not consult Mosaic faith or tabernacle worship in the Restoration Project, neither should we consult Nicene faith or its liturgy. Happily, for the Old Testament, even the radical discontinuity preached in Alexander's Sermon on the Law cannot decanonize the Old Testament. As Thomas Campbell admits, it is, after all, still Scripture and worth the effort of our study, even if we're not sure what to do with it. In most printings of the New Testament, the Old Testament comes along for the ride. And everywhere you look in the New Testament writers are talking about the Old Testament. Church history, though, can't similarly ride the coattails of the New Testament. Okay? We can't completely ignore the Old Testament, but church history is not only marginalized, it's also decanonized. The study of church history in our movement often means going back to 1809. The rest is esoteric. It would seem that Restorationism and church history are strange bedfellows. The result is that in the Restoration movement, church history has not received a bad rap as much as no rap. So let me ask some critical questions about Thomas Campbell's dictum. Nothing not as old as the New Testament. And forget the question of making something obligatory in the church. He says, nothing ought to be received into the faith or worship of the church that is not as old as the New Testament. Okay, everybody got the dictum down. Okay, I see two problems with this. First, the dictum is self-referentially incoherent. That is, it is self-contradictory. You have heard other self-contradictory statements like this. For example, the confident assertion that there is no such thing as truth. Okay? Or you must only believe propositions that can be empirically proved. Such examples of cliched nonsense, which are common among the half-educated, suffer from self-referential incoherence. Each fails to meet its own criterion. Unfortunately, Campbell's dictum, as far as I can see, suffers from the same ailment. For the dictum, nothing not as old as the New Testament is itself, of course, not as old as the New Testament. It fails to meet its own criterion. This is a problem of logic. Second, even if we were to grant that the spirit, if not the letter of this dictum, is contained in the New Testament, let's say on a generous reading of Jesus' reminder that people should not live by bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Let's just say that somehow that means nothing not as old as the New Testament. Okay, let's say it's in there somewhere. There's yet another problem with the dictum. And this is a problem of definition. What does Campbell mean when he says the New Testament? If we define New Testament as the codification of the list of 27 books, no more and no less, then the earliest that we can date this is 367. In this case, Campbell means nothing not as old as the 4th century. That is supposed to be funny. If so, we can at least, thanks. We can at least receive into the faith and worship of the church, to name some things at random, the monopiscopacy, standalone church buildings, and the consubstantiality of the Son as articulated by Nicaea. Those are 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century innovations, respectively. For these and other such things would be as old as the 27-book defined New Testament canon per Athanasius. But I suspect that this is not what Thomas Campbell meant. When he said nothing not as old as the New Testament, he meant when the books were actually written. In other words, roughly the extent of the 1st century. And if that is his intention, and I'm sure it is, let me offer this gloss of the dictum. Nothing ought to be received into the faith or worship of the church that was not believed or practiced in the 1st century. Now, what's the problem with this? I'm glad you asked. The problem, again, is that the idea of a 27-book New Testament canon, so central to our faith and to Campbell's, was not known or believed at the end of the first century. Now, we should readily admit that the idea of authoritative apostolic writing is present in the first century. The apostolic consciousness of recording the gospel for a wide audience is also present. And there was probably a collection of Paul's letters by the turn of the second century. We can grant all that, but there is simply no such thing as a 27-book New Testament, or even an idea of a closed New Testament canon by the end of the first century. In other words, the New Testament canon is not as old as the New Testament. Ergo, on Thomas Campbell's rule, because it is not part of the faith or worship of the first century church, the 27-book canon ought not to be received into the faith or worship of the church. Not unlike the first problem I mentioned, this is a problem of simple consistency. I wonder if you are wondering where I'm going with this. It is for all these reasons that we also cannot give anything more than passing consideration to slogans such as "No creed but Christ" and "No creed but the Bible." Whatever they possess in rhetorical force, they lack in coherence and meaning. Now, why am I pointing out all of this? I'm not just being snarky, although I intend to be just a little bit, maybe. But there's a real problem with the dictum, which is an important and oft-quoted phrase in what is considered to be a foundational, or at least representative, document in churches of Christ, and particularly on this point. Taking the dictum at face value, it is impossible to contend for or bind on the church the 27-book New Testament canon, which was defined and recognized by the church in the late 4th century. Probably none of us here is willing to toss that canon. So, what do? We make an exception. But if we make one exception, what stops us from making other exceptions with regard to developments in the early church or in its subsequent history? And here's my point. Let us listen to the wisdom of the church through the ages. If we give the 4th century, post-Nicene, post-Constantinian church a pass on its acceptance of the New Testament canon, why can't we also attend to its Christology and ecclesiology, its biblical interpretation and piety? Now, I didn't say slavishly follow it. I said attend to it. Listen to it. That means letting the church fathers and mothers, the medieval scholastics and mystics, the reformers and restorers, all have a seat at the table. It means hearing the voice of the past with discernment. Whether we mean to invite them to the table or not, we are influenced and shaped by the developments in church history in ways that we often fail to acknowledge. We fail to acknowledge them mostly because we take these developments for granted. For example, when we take the New Testament table of contents page for granted as an unquestionable truth, as if it is from the 1st century. Like Thomas Campbell, we make an exception to the dictum. Unlike Thomas Campbell, I contend for making such exceptions with clear eyes and full awareness.